Hello, listeners. This is Nilpal Bhattacharya. Welcome to the first episode of AI Now. We have with us today Ankita Malik, research member at the Indian Society of AI and Law. We shall be discussing and understanding the recommendations report drafted by her and her co-author Nav Dhawan on August 10th, which has been submitted to the NITI Aayog, Government of India, on the call for recommendations for a draft paper, published by the body on July 21st, 2020 on responsible AI. Their recommendations are indeed brilliant and have been received well. So today we have an opportunity of getting to know the concept firsthand from the authors themselves. We shall also be enlightened by the authors upon the recommendations that they have put in, and also they shall be answering a few questions. So here we go. Right off the bat, I'd like to invite Abhivardhan sir, founder, chairperson, and managing trustee of the ISAIL and Internationalism, to brief us and the listeners on the concept of responsible AI itself. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mudutpal, for inviting me for the podcast. So, as you're discussing responsible AI and this draft paper by the NITI Aayog, we must understand that responsible AI, like explainable AI and all that, which is a compound aspect of artificial intelligence in management sciences and computer sciences, is a developing concept. So, for India, one thing is for sure that since we are allies to the West a lot, yet we say we are non-aligned. Ideally, we will have a leaning towards how the West reacts. But the best part is that, like Africans, Indians have a very interesting opportunity that they can economize or whatever they have, and that's where responsible AI comes in because economics and rule of law actually merge here. So, beyond social responsibility and cultural responsibility, which is a very deeper and complex issue, a responsible AI approach for India perhaps is related with the idea as to how we will deal with it, how we will decide the juristic persona, how we will make the decision making and adjudicatory mechanisms. And when we know that there is a sense of limited globalization and the rise of splint in it, then how will this work out? So I'll pass the baton to you, Mrudupal, and now you can continue.
Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. Now the first question to Ankita is, with reference to the black box problem, it's in a general sense said to refer to the inability of a human being, often the programmer himself, in trying to figure out why an artificial intelligence system made a certain decision, owing to numerous complex procedures occurring simultaneously, which is too overwhelming for a programmer or any user to reverse engineer to reach the root of the decision which was made. What exactly might the problems be, and how severe do you think can they be?
Right. Thank you, Mizatpal. So your question, I'll answer it in two parts. Firstly, with regard to what exactly might the problem be. Now, the black box problem is basically when there's a lack of information with regard to how the particular AI has reached that particular conclusion. So, in this case, the deep neural network, which is operating with the help of artificial neurons, it processes such complex data that it makes it close to impossible to ascertain how that particular decision was concluded. So, this primarily is termed as the problem of transparency. Apart from that, there's another reason for the same, for the black box problem, and that is the issue of dimensionality. So here, support vectors are used by the artificial intelligence, and the same cannot be visualized by humans. So, as is rightly pointed out in the working document itself, there might be instances where there are spurious correlations, which would not create errors in the data set or the test sets, but they could prove to be a big problem during actual deployment. And especially since we don't know how the correlation was arrived at, this would create a policy problem. The second part comes in as to how severe can they be. Now, we relate it to the policy question. So, the policy question here, as it directly relates, is to building trust. So, we need to build trust within the artificial intelligence system. And how do we do that? all the users, endpoints, all the parties involved, they should understand how that artificial intelligence comes to a certain conclusion. If the methodology followed for the decision making process itself is known, it ultimately affords more credibility and reliability to the decision. So, also with regard to a weaker black box problem, it can still be reverse engineered. However, the problem becomes more severe when we're dealing with black boxes or artificial intelligence which have stronger black boxes and they're working autonomously. So, this entire policy problem is based on the recognized principle that there needs to be some sort of transparency for credible functioning. And this should be used during the deployment of the artificial intelligence itself.
Okay, that was insightful. Okay, moving on. When talking about dimensionality, you talked about dimensionality and support vectors. Uh, what are these support vectors and what do they mean?
Right. So here, some machine learning algorithms are opaque to human beings. And this is because they arrive at decisions by looking at a lot of variables at once. So what they do is they find geometric patterns amongst these variables, and this cannot primarily be visualized by human beings. So what the SVM or the support vector machine does is it illustrates this. So sometimes it might happen that the SVMs don't use straight lines to divide data. They that which is basically a mathematical method which is used by the SVMs for non-linear divisions. So when that happens, when the number of variables or the features provided to a support vector machine becomes so large, it is virtually impossible to visualize how that model is simultaneously drawing distinctions between data based on all of these numerous features. So, an AI that uses SVMs to process dozens or perhaps hundreds of variables would thus be a black box problem to humans, and because of the dimensionality of the model itself. Now, even if the SVM is shallow relatively to a deep neural network, the problem of dimensionality would not allow us to understand how exactly has the SVM come to that conclusion.
Alright, and in reference to these problems, how might the doctrine of intent be affected?
Right. So this takes us to the legal implications of having artificial intelligence interface within our daily lives. So, as we talked before about the issues of transparency and dimensionality, which ultimately give rise to the black box problem, we look at what legal implications they might have. So, like you said, what might the how might the doctrine of intent be affected by such problems? So, intent tests have appeared throughout the history of law, and they've been constantly developing in order to aid courts, basically to understand and regulate human conduct. So, why do we consider this important? Is because of the fact that it it is a means of finding out whether a person intended to cause the particular outcome to occur or not. So, an intent may determine the severity of the penalty, whether that severity is appropriate, to what extent should the person be liable. So the problem which arises here is that machines and computers inherently they don't have intent. So where do we move forward from there? The black box problem again further intensifies the situation as we don't even now understand how or why did the machine come to that particular conclusion, let alone knowing the intent. So the tests which have been formulated over the years in order to determine intent and causation, they would ultimately be of very little use in this scenario. So there might be a lot of issues connected to various legal doctrines which use the aspects of mens rea or intent and causation. Since machines, as I said earlier, machines and computer programs don't have intent. So where do we move forward from there?
Okay, so that was about the part of the machines. Now, with reference to the machine bias problem, in the earlier years of criminology, racial biases were present throughout the Western world. Hell, they are still present. Individuals of color were seen as potential criminals. As bizarre as it may sound, individuals who had bodily abnormalities or defects or long hands or legs were considered to be criminals. Women with warts, molasses were considered to be witches and were executed during the same witch hunts. Further, into the future, racial biases were still present. In fact, we have seen a recent case where police brutality was exhibited concerning an individual of color in the US, a first world country, a superpower. So, considering these unfortunate events, won't it be wise to say that bias is an inherent bacterium that we cannot get rid of, especially in a country such as India, which has not seen the levels of advancement in terms of technology that the Western world has seen? Also, the same biased individuals might actually program an artificial intelligence system. So, what is to stop them from programming their biases into the system?
Thank you, Milpa. This is, in fact, a very interesting question. So again, I would be relating it to the black box problem. So here, the programmer may not be able to predict or recognize how or why a decision was made by the AI. So it can result in some incorrect decisions, which ultimately cannot be traced. So it could lead to the exclusion of certain members of society from benefits that they are entitled to by the state. So, for example, an artificial intelligence system is used to determine the eligibility of certain members of the society for a certain scheme of the government. Now, if the data sets are inherently biased, the output that is going to be received is again going to be biased, and due to that, a lot of people might be removed from the ambit of benefit. And another example, as you said, with regard to the bias that has been existing, can be seen where an artificial intelligence was used to predict recidivism, and it acted in a largely discriminatory manner, where it concluded that people of color were more prone to recidivism. So, this stems from the problem of machine bias inherently. Now, even though it is an extremely severe problem, I would disagree with the statement that it cannot be cured. Further, it's important to understand that machines are not inherently biased. This bias results from the data sets that are used, and an inquiry into the data sets used does offer an explanation to the bias that a machine has incorporated over a period of time. So, giving an example of how we can battle these biases, let's look at one of the examples of what IBM has been doing. So, IBM has been developing methodologies which would help in reducing machine bias, even when the initial training data sets are not available. So, what they've developed is a three-level rating system, which is used for ascertaining the level of relative fairness by rating the same on parameters of presence of bias or inheritance of bias or the capability to introduce bias, regardless of whether the training data sets are available or not. And again, focusing and aiming at more democratized data would definitely help reduce the problem of bias.
Alright, so it's more about the contamination of the data sets provided by these members of these people who are programming the AIs who happen to be inherently biased. So on that note, how can possibly a contaminated data set be identified?
Right. So, in order to identify these contaminated data sets, I would say it's first very important to understand the problem. What are we dealing with? So, data sets about human beings are particularly susceptible to bias, whereas data about the physical world is less susceptible due to the issue of objectivity. But the bias showing up in an artificial intelligence isn't an automatic sign of deliberate or malicious injunction of the programmer's bias into their project. So it's not always that if a contaminated data set is detected or generated, it is due to the fact that the programmer has intentionally embedded the same. These are programs that are simply reflecting the example of biases that already exist. So this might be existing social prejudices or cultural assumptions that have a history of being published. So I'll give you an example. So for example, a word embedding model. So initially, the data training set that was put had the word CEO, and upon the algorithms working, the word embedding model embedded the word man with CEO. So this is primarily a reflection of existing societal prejudices that are there in the society. But again, it is also to be taken into consideration that data engineers can also introduce other avenues of bias by their use of restrictive data sets. Therefore, our focus should be on both creating an unbiased data set as well as unbiased AI algorithms, which are mainly connected to each other. And the second thing is that people who are working in the field, they must recognize biased data and they should actively seek to counteract it. Now, one important thing that this requires, or this recognition requires, is training. We need to train the people to detect where exactly the bias stems from, or if the outputs that are being given out are biased. But if you're asking us whether contaminated data sets at the very outset can be identified, it is humanly impossible to identify the same. However, we can increase the amount of test sets in order to validate the final outputs that does come out of the AI. But per se, just by looking at it or by a very preliminary approach, we cannot identify a contaminated data set.
Alright, so it's more like checking, 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 and cross checking. Well, with reference to the significance allotted to Articles 13 and 14 of the GDPR in your paper, could you please enlighten us on the said provisions and their relevance?
Sure. So again, I bring into consideration the concepts of transparency and whether this transparency is achievable or not. And we thought a good source to draw that from would be the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, Section 13 of the GDPR, it provides for a system of consent along with a system of checks and balances. So here, there is an accountability that has been maintained upon the controller. So it states that if any personal data relating to a data subject is collected, then the controller will provide that person with certain prescribed information. Whereas Section 14, it deals with information to be provided where personal data has not been obtained from the data subject. So when both of these are combined, it provides a sort of a solution for the problem of reliability, because since there is accountability and there is transparency in terms of information dissemination, there is again going to be more trust is going to be embedded into the system. So the relevance of this is primarily to build trust, and which will ultimately help us achieve our aim of ethics in AI.
Okay. So, with reference to accountability of an artificial intelligence system, could you please elaborate on the concept of applying vicarious liability to artificial intelligence systems in a pro rata fashion?
Yes. So, considering that the black box problem is very prominent right now, and we haven't developed a solution for it, it is important to customize pre-existing rules for assigning accountability for any harm which has arisen from maybe a specific action of the artificial intelligence. So, one such possibility is that of the principle of vicarious liability. Anyone who knows about the principle of vicarious liability would understand that this cannot have a blanket uniform application here wherever credibility has been compromised. However, the same can be applied with a pro rata approach. So, in terms of circumstances where the AI was designed to achieve a specific task, or the probability of externalizing the failure on others is higher, this would attract a stricter application of the liability principle. Now, this is specific for situations where the black box problem was very strong and the AI was working autonomously and was taking independent decisions. So, in these cases, why do we say that there must be liability imposed on the user or creator? Because a lack of transparency should not insulate the user or creator from the AI liability. Instead, the risks of deploying a black box problem autonomously in such a setting should fall on the AI user or creator. Because ultimately, the artificial intelligence was used, notwithstanding its unpredictable and impenetrable decision making. And for situations where the probability of externalizing risk is lower, we could always use the test of foreseeability to help determine whether the consequences which occurred were they apparent or reasonably foreseeable or not. So we can definitely divide it into two ways in which the vicarious liability can be applied.
Okay. So back to brass tacks. How receptive would you say India as a nation, as a society, will be towards the advent of artificial intelligence into the daily lives? And what might the initial reactions and repercussions be?
Right. So, before I answer this question, let's look at where India ranks according to the Government AI Readiness Index that was compiled by Oxford Insights and the International Development Research Center. So, India ranks 17th. And if we look at the programs that are being set up right now, we have the NITI Aayog's AI for All initiative, which is again working for better AI regulation and promotion mechanism. And so basically, the working document also looks at these umbrella legislations that are already existing. So, for example, the Consumer Protection Act, which can be used in certain instances or for certain specific circumstances. But if we are looking for more AI specific laws, we're slowly moving towards it. And an example of that could be SEBI's circular on AI ML applications. However, a characteristic feature of this has been that these laws and these legislations, they were focused around solving the problems relating to security and privacy. So when we're talking about the initial reactions or the repercussions, it'll depend a lot upon what the government does and what is the level of trust building that has been undertaken.
Okay, so the arrival of artificial intelligence into our daily lives and commerce would ascertain an industrial revolution. That much is for sure. But the disruptive nature of an artificial intelligence would ensure job losses, which would cause poverty to rise eventually. How do you think that is to be tackled? Also, what new opportunities do you think will appear for the citizenry of India in terms of jobs?
Right. So I think with regard to this question, we need to look at two perspectives of artificial intelligence. Now, in 2016, AI was actually dubbed as the fourth industrial revolution by the World Economic Forum. And the rise of AI is expected to boost the economic growth. But like you said, there's going to be a multitude of current business models which will be disrupted, and a lot, in fact, millions of existing jobs will be automated, primarily repetitive task jobs. The advancement of artificial intelligence will affect job prospects for the large and young population of India, because we see that there are around 17 million new entrants in the workforce every year. In comparison, we have only 5.5 million jobs that are actually created for them. So it is predicted that AI will have a severe impact on jobs, but it is also predicted that this is going to be more short term, because in the coming years the impact will start to even out, as we've seen with most industrial revolutions. While there will be a reduction in jobs, there is also going to be new role substitutions and new job creations, because the technology encompasses the potential of that. With regard to what opportunities will appear for the citizens of India, and how these may be tackled, I think the Indian government should be very proactive in collecting data, because this again draws from the principle that if we don't know what we are dealing with, we won't know what is the gravity of the situation. So, collecting data on employment and using estimates of employment variables, or periodic economy wide skill gap analysis, these things can help prepare the labor market for the future. Because we cannot stop AI from having an interface with the economy. So it's only fair that we prepare our markets for the future. And the massive consumer market of India can actually be leveraged to access latest technology through the assertion of technology transfer via various FDI deals. And we can also have global firms being encouraged to transfer advanced technology or creating joint ventures. And one important aspect of this, of tackling such a situation, is that the government could boost employment in areas which are less vulnerable to automation. So, for example, we have the education sector or the healthcare sector. These are areas which involve high human engagement, and it's not easy to be automated. It is not automated easily. So if we know where to focus on and what exactly the problem we're dealing with is, we would definitely be better equipped to deal with such a situation.
Okay, so let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope that it does not turn out to be a Terminator apocalyptic like future. So, what in your opinion is abstaining the masses from pursuing AI research and studies?
Right. So, with regard to this, I think it's awareness primarily. And this lack of awareness has also sort of fueled their distrust into technology because they don't know what they're dealing with. And apart from that, we also need to take into consideration the aspect of accessibility, because India, we know, is still developing as a nation. And the questions which come with regard to this is, do we have the resources that are required for such a massive outreach? And do we have the resources for implementation of such high technology? So I think awareness and accessibility can be two reasons why the masses are abstaining from pursuing AI research and studies.
Okay, so lastly, in your opinion, what is the potential of this responsible AI concept? And if achieved, what victories might it unlock for us Indians besides technological advancements? Also, how feasible and achievable does it seem to you? And what amount of time would you say will be needed for responsible AIs to be cradled and deployed?
Right. So, with regard to my opinion for the potential, I guess working on the NITI Aayog's working document has helped me personally understand the potential that responsible AI has. AI has. So, we are looking at ethics and the ethical guidelines. So, such aspects are accountability, privacy, fairness, justice. So, these are considered as these minimum requirements for building and using an ethically sound artificial intelligence. And considering India, which is a country which is so diverse, or be it cultural diversity or religious diversity, we cannot primarily aim at development in one direction alone. It has to be a more holistic approach where we are taking into consideration the ethical considerations as well as development, as well as how it will interact with our economy. All of these are extremely important. So I think it is feasible and achievable. However, we have a long way to go because we're still at a nascent stage of this development. We're still trying to solve our policy questions. And while we're doing that, we have to understand that questions about policy considerations are going to change, the dynamics of nation states are going to change, the way our economy functions will change. So we're going to have to be more adaptive to a lot newer and contemporary ideas that we currently see.
Hmm. So here we are. I believe that the listeners have enjoyed this interaction as much as I have. Thank you, Ankita. This session was very nice, insightful, and interesting. Thank you, Abhivardhan sir, for letting me have this podcast. Stay safe, guys. Stay tuned for the second episode. Farewell. Godspeed.